Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 cases of people found where they definitely shouldn't have been. And each of these is incredibly creepy, disturbing, and confusing. So as always, viewer discretion is advised. Kasuya is a small town in Japan's Fukoku prefecture with a population today of around 46,000 people. 20 years ago, that figure was just more than 36,000, so it's the type of place that's been growing, but not nearly to the point of bursting at the seams. In 2008, just as it is today, Kasuya was free of the characteristics more often found in big cities like higher crime rates, drugs, and homelessness. For those who preferred a quaint and quiet setting, Kasuya was and still is a solid choice. The 57-year-old man in this story made Kasuya his home for that exact reason. Because his name has never been released publicly, he'll be referred to as Yamada Taro, which is the Japanese equivalent of John Doe. Yamada lived in a cozy one-story house laid out using a traditional Japanese floor plan with each room separated from the next, unlike the open-concept homes seen in the West. It was a modest but comfortable existence, and it was just enough for Yamada. Since he was unmarried and lived alone, everything inside his house was just as he liked it, so when he noticed that food was disappearing from his refrigerator, he was confused. At first, he thought he was just mistaken, but more and more, he was finding less food in his fridge than when he'd leave in the morning for work. There was no obvious explanation for where it was going, and Yamada began to question his own sanity. Keeping track of the food was easy. He paid attention to what he ate, he didn't have pets, no one else had a key to his house, and he didn't have guests over often. Still, it was undeniable that something was happening inside of his fridge when he left the house. After he realized that he was neither mistaken nor crazy, the only thing he could come up with was sleep eating. Sleep-related eating disorder is a real condition that causes those with it to sleepwalk and involuntarily consume food. People with the disorder never even wake up during this phenomenon and have no recollection of it in the morning. But this explanation didn't make sense though. As far as he knew, he'd never even walked in his sleep before. But the disorder can develop slowly or show up suddenly, and in either case, it's a long-lasting condition. There was a chance this could be the answer to the disappearing food, but it seemed unlikely. Those who eat food while sleepwalking often binge eat in the act and injure themselves while traveling to and from the kitchen as well. There's also the threat of choking, house fires, and burns, yet Yamada had no unexplained bruises or burns, and he never woke up feeling like his stomach was full. When he all but ruled that out, he started to wonder if his home was haunted. He'd often hear noises he couldn't find an explanation for. Occasional thumps from another bedroom or the sound of a plastic bottle crinkling somewhere in the house would catch his attention. Yet when he'd go to investigate, he'd find nothing out of the ordinary. Yamada also wasn't the type to entertain the possibility of the supernatural, so he finally came to the conclusion that he was being robbed. The problem with this idea, though, was that there wasn't a single thing anywhere else in the house that was ever disturbed or missing. He'd leave for work each day, then come home and find everything exactly the way he left it until he looked in the fridge. As this continued, he started taking every possible security precaution. Almost obsessively, he checked the windows and doors before he left the house and after he returned home. When he found out that food was still disappearing while everything was locked up tight, Yamada felt his first wave of fear. If he was being robbed, whoever was doing it must have had a key since his doors would always be deadbolted when he returned home. And if he was being robbed, why would someone commit such a serious crime just for a few bites of food? None of what he was experiencing made any sense. If he was going to get to the bottom of what was going on, Yamada had to keep watch over his apartment every minute of every day. So he went out and bought several security cameras and installed them in various places in the house, making sure that one was pointed directly at the refrigerator with a wide view of the kitchen. The video feeds could be accessed from his cell phone, and he'd be alerted if any of them detected motion. So no matter where he was, he'd know the moment something was happening inside his house. Sure enough, not long after he installed the cameras, his phone buzzed with a motion alert. He picked it up and opened the app, and after months of racking his brain to come up with some sort of explanation for his refrigerator being raided almost every day, Yamada finally knew what was happening, and it caused his blood to run cold. He immediately closed the app and called the police to report what he saw. Officers were then dispatched to check the house, but when they arrived and knocked on the door, no one answered. There were no signs of a break-in or anything else suspicious, so they left and called Yamada to let him know that the house was fine. This was not the result he was hoping for. He then asked the police to return to his house, and this time he'd meet them there and let them inside to search. When he got home, Yamada showed the officers what his video feed picked up, and they were just as stunned as he was. They began a thorough search of his house, but he was neat and kept a clutter-free house, so despite what was caught on camera, everything looked just as it should be. One of the officers then entered the last room in the house that had yet to be searched, and it was clearly a room Yamada used sparingly. It was a simple spare bedroom with a perfectly made bed and spotless furniture. It didn't take much to see that nothing was out of the ordinary in the room, so he turned to the closet. When he slid the door open, he jumped back and screamed for the other officer and Yamada. In the corner of the closet was a woman trembling with fear, curled up on her side and hugging her purse to her chest. The officers then placed the woman under arrest and removed her from Yamada's house. The story she told when she was interviewed by police was as beyond belief as it was horrifying. The woman's name was Tetsuko, and she was a 58-year-old homeless woman. Apparently, when Yamada left the house one day, he forgot to lock the door. Kasuya was the type of town where people could leave their doors unlocked with very little chance of consequences. So when Yamada discovered his mistake as he arrived home, it barely registered as anything more than a minor moment of carelessness. In the grand scheme of things, that's exactly what it was, but Tetsuko just happened to be watching as Yamada left his house that day. When his car was out of sight, she approached his door and wiggled the handle. To her surprise, the door opened and she let herself in. In the bedroom closet she was found in, Tetsuko had made herself a home. Built into the closet was a top-shelf cupboard where Yamada neatly kept all of his spare bedsheets and a thin futon mattress. The space was just big enough for her to lie down in, so Tetsuko put the mattress over these stacks of bedsheets on the top shelf, and that's where she slept. When police discovered her hiding spot, it was organized and well kept with the exception of several plastic water bottles around the mattress. This explained the strange popping noises Yamada would occasionally hear, and the dull thumps he heard were caused by Tetsuko accidentally hitting the wall or the closet door. The footage that he captured that day showed Yamada doing his usual last-minute security check before leaving for the day. After he walked out the door, the camera showed a still, silent house. When Yamada had been gone for a while and she was sure he wouldn't be coming back for anything, Tetsuko came down from the closet shelf, wandered into the kitchen, and opened the refrigerator door. She stood there for a while, looking over what Yamada had available to eat. When she spotted something she was in the mood for, she'd take a few bites and then put it back. She did this with a few items before washing it all down with some milk and drinking it straight from the carton. When she was done, she put the milk back, closed the fridge, walked into Yamada's living room, sat down on the couch, and watched television. And she would tell police that she commonly spent the daytime hours performing that exact routine. She'd watch television all day and then return to the closet before Yamada came home. Throughout her time in the house, she would use the bathroom and shower when Yamada was gone, which led police to describe her as neat and clean in the report of the incident. Whenever it was time for Tetsuko to go back into her hiding near the end of the workday, she'd meticulously clean up to remove any trace of her presence. She cleaned the toilet and shower after each use, and she returned anything she used to the exact place she found it. Her ability to essentially live with Yamada and go undetected indicated that this wasn't the first time she had done this. Tetsuko never admitted it, but police believe she had established hiding places in a handful of houses in the area and cycled between them almost on a daily basis. But despite the access to Yamada's home and likely several others, it was surprising to police that she'd never stolen money or any other items of value to sell. Nothing about the case, though, was more stunning than how long Tetsuko had been living in Yamada's home without his knowledge. Since the day she first entered his home, more than a full year had passed. By the time Yamada caught wind of anything going on, Tetsuko had already spent more than 6 months as his uninvited guest. Afterwards, she was charged with trespassing, but when Yamada learned the details from her police interview, he dropped the charges against her and she was allowed to go free. In late September of 2003, the Collective Cabaret Bar in Winnipeg, Canada started to get a reputation for smelling bad. People in neighboring businesses thought that maybe there was a problem with the sewers or something, so every day they'd light incense sticks around the place to eliminate as much of the stench as possible. They hadn't noticed the scent earlier in the year, but after Winnipeg's smoking ban took effect that September, the stench of tobacco stopped masking whatever that smell was. The club did all they could, deep cleaning drains and air ducts and anything else they could think of, but instead of helping, the smell seemed to just get worse. A couple of months later, on December 3rd, some of the bar's neighbors finally couldn't take it anymore and complained to the police. The police then sent a small team to see if they could try to find the source of the smell, and they would manage to determine that the smell seemed to be coming from somewhere downstairs. Then, the closer they got to a wall at the back of the basement, the stronger the stench became. Then they found a small gap in the side of this wall. It was a fake partition made of drywall that leaned against the original concrete walls to make the room square. Whatever they were smelling was definitely behind the wall, but they couldn't get through the gap because it was too small to fit through. They eventually asked a duct cleaning company if they could borrow a remote control camera used to inspect pipes and holes like this, and the company sent the equipment over. Then they fed the camera inside, but as they pushed forward, the lens came loose and fell to the bottom. Luckily, the bar owner planned on renovating the basement anyway, so finally he just let the police break through the drywall to get it. They were able to retrieve both the lens and determine the source of the smell. 14 months before police started investigating, DJ Fenosis, also known as Grandmaster Sanchez or Eduardo Sanchez to his parents, had a night off. He was well known in the Winnipeg music scene, and he DJ'd at several venues around Winnipeg, but one of his favorite venues was the Collective Cabaret. The Collective was part of an area known as Osborne Village that in the early 2000s was a creative hub for all kinds of alternative music. To Eduardo, it was a little community of people just like him. Like many 21-year-olds, Eduardo also knew how to party. He also worked a day job, and when he wasn't DJing on the weekend, he'd meet up with his friends and they'd head to the Collective for a night out. On Friday, October 11th, 2002, he worked an evening shift and then finished at 11 p.m. Afterward, he wanted to party, so he headed straight from work to meet his friends at the Collective Cabaret. He drank a few beers and a tequila shot or two and eventually drew $80 in cash from an ATM at the entrance at 12:48 a.m. A few hours later, Eduardo left the Collective to talk with some friends in a car parked on the street. Then he walked back to the bar, briefly talking to someone he knew at the entrance before walking back down the stairs that led into the club. And that's the last anyone remembers seeing Eduardo. He was reported missing the next day after he didn't come home, but it took a week for the police to begin looking for him. He was young, and young men were known to disappear for short amounts of time, so they felt they had to make sure he hadn't left on his own free will. Right away, though, Eduardo's sister was convinced that something had happened. She knew it wasn't like him to just disappear. But despite how upset she was about him going missing, she focused on practical ways she could find her brother. As soon as he went missing, she and her friends went out in the evening to put up posters and went to any places Eduardo might have gone around Osborne Village. She also spent days scouring the internet for anything that might be a clue, but a month later, there was still no sign of Eduardo. During this time, his mother was sure he was still alive somewhere and regularly begged for him to come home in the press. The family even held a fundraiser to pay for a private investigator, but the PI couldn't find any trace of Eduardo. 14 months eventually went by since his disappearance, and despite the private investigations and police inquiries, there was just nothing. It was like Eduardo had just walked into the club and vanished. Then, in December 2003, police broke open a fake wall in the basement of Collective Cabaret to look for the missing lens. During this, they found it and the decomposing body of Eduardo. At some point early in the morning, the day he disappeared, Eduardo had decided to go into the club's basement. He was allowed to go down there because it was where they stored records and CDs, and he would regularly go into that room to look for tracks he might play during his next set. Even though he wasn't booked that night, that wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what he did next. At some point, Eduardo seemed to have spotted the small hole in the fake wall. Looking through, he saw the gap between the drywall and the concrete and decided he wanted to explore inside. No one is sure why he chose to crawl between the two walls, but somehow he squeezed himself into a space too small for police officers to fit through and crawled along the top of the gap. The distance between the walls was 73 feet long, and at the top it was a few feet wide, but at the bottom, where the drywall met the concrete floor, there was less than 10 inches of space. According to forensics, Eduardo made it the entire 73 feet before turning around and then coming back. Unfortunately, he managed just 13 feet of this return trip when he lost his footing and fell into the narrow section at the bottom. And as he hit the bottom, he got wedged in a crooked position. He was pinned so tightly he couldn't even expand his chest. His back was trapped against the opposite wall and his neck was forced down, also crushing his airway. He also couldn't move his arms and legs either, meaning he was completely stuck. He probably tried to make as much noise as he could while trying to get free, but there wasn't much noise he could make. He couldn't scream because he couldn't breathe, and he couldn't bang on the wall because his limbs were pinned. Even if he could make noise, no one upstairs would have been able to hear him over the club's music. If they did, who would have thought that a guy had tried to climb down the inside of a basement wall? So, unable to breathe or get unstuck, Eduardo passed out and then passed away. Thankfully for him, he likely lost consciousness in moments, avoiding the pain of the asphyxia-induced cardiac arrest that followed. An autopsy later revealed that his death was due to something known as positional asphyxia, which is when the body is in an unusual position that makes it impossible to breathe. Sometimes it happens when pressure on the back stops the diaphragm from being able to move, and other times the windpipe gets stretched too far after the head gets pinned down into the chest. That also blocks the nose and mouth, restricting breathing even more. Eduardo seems to have had both his back compressed and his head trapped. There's also another form of this called violent positional asphyxia, and it's when someone does that on purpose by kneeling on your back or your neck, but there was nothing to suggest Eduardo's death was the result of that. Incidentally, positional asphyxia is also a common cause of death among cavers and cave divers when they misjudge a gap and get stuck. In the end, police concluded that the gap in the wall was so small that it would have been nearly impossible for anyone to have forced him inside, ruling out foul play. So, it seems that for whatever reason, Eduardo went into the gap that night and then accidentally fell and passed out shortly afterward, leaving him to be found months later. Every year in June at an abandoned orchard 2 miles north of Casnovia, Michigan, there was a keg party. And this was more than just a party, it was a big event, and if you were young, from that area, and at all sociable, you'd be at that party. Despite being a marshy spot with hip-high grass, as far as you can see, it attracted anything from 50 to 100 people most years. In 2005, the date for the party was Saturday, June 11th, and as always, Todd Gieb, who lived nearby, would be there. After getting home, he got dressed up and set off to meet his friends at the Half Moon Bar and Grill in the center of town. They had drinks there for a couple of hours and then left for the big gathering up the road. For most of the night, Todd and his friends drank and danced, and then at around 12:40, a fight started at the party. It's not clear if Todd was involved, but either way, just 5 minutes later, he called one of his friends to tell him that he'd had enough and he was gonna walk home. 2 minutes after that, Todd called another friend. This time, he sounded out of breath and he told her he was in a field and then either hung up or the call was cut off. This was obviously concerning, so the friend called back and the phone was answered, but she wasn't sure if it was Todd or someone else. All she could hear was either heavy breathing or wind, and after that call ended, they tried calling him twice, but the next 2 phone calls just rang until going to voicemail. And his friend was right to be concerned because Todd never made it home that night. Somewhere in the 45-minute from the party to his apartment, Todd seems to have taken a wrong turn. When he didn't get home the next day, his mom filed a missing persons report, and then less than 19 hours after he left the party, search and rescue was out looking for him. They started by setting up teams to search the fields around where the party had been. Then, 2 days after the party on Monday morning, more than 100 people, bloodhounds, a helicopter, and an airboat were added to the hunt. Police also checked the local hospitals and even jails, but Todd wasn't there either. At some point during this, the dogs caught his scent and followed it down a dirt road, but lost it where it ended at a main road. Because of this, police briefly entertained the idea that Todd might have been a victim of a hit and run. Then after getting hit, whoever it was picked him up to cover it up. So afterward, they checked garages and body shops for suspicious activity, but again, this led nowhere. The following day on Tuesday, the search widened, all-terrain vehicles were added, and they began heading into the dense woods and marshes. They even went back over the areas they'd already searched in case they missed anything. But by Wednesday, after the immediate area was thoroughly searched, police concluded he wasn't nearby and pulled their resources out. Understandably, his family kept looking for their son afterward, and they were willing to try everything. They would even go on to hire a psychic, and on June 19th, just over a week after Todd had gone missing, the psychic claimed Todd was dead and that his body was partly submerged close to a lone tree by a small marsh 900 feet from the keg party. Despite skepticism, the police would go out to search the area, but this would again turn up nothing. Amazingly, the psychic seems to have been pretty spot on except for the distance. 3 weeks to the day after Todd went missing, a couple walking on a lake nearby named Ovidal Lake found Todd's body. He was found 1,500 feet to the north of the party, not 900 as the psychic said. Strangely, he was upright in the water with his head and shoulders sticking out close to the marshy shore. The position was so weird that to the couple that found him, he looked like he was swimming. For police, this more or less explained what had happened. Based on how he was found, police suggested that Todd had accidentally set off in the opposite direction from the route that would take him home. Then he walked up the road, climbed over a gate onto a private dirt road, and then toward the lake. At some point during this, he must have dropped his phone because it's never been found. Then, once at the lake, he must have decided to go for a swim, fully clothed, his wallet still in his pocket, and then drowned due to being under the influence. If this explanation is confusing to you, you are not alone. It's not just the circumstances that are weird. Another thing that makes the death suspicious is the autopsy report. The first thing that's strange is that there seem to be conflicting details in the report. For example, at one point it mentions that the body was found face down, and then in another part it mentions the body was found face up. There's also some evidence to suggest that he might not have drowned at all. When someone dies, their blood begins to pool in certain regions of the body, and it causes those parts to discolor. This is known as lividity. If the body had been found face down in the water, that pooling would be in the face and chest, and that's what they discovered. But Todd was found upright, so the question is, when was he lying face down? It had to have been before he got into the water, which means that he must have died earlier. Also, although the report did say he had some water in his lungs, it wasn't consistent with a typical drowning. His toxicology report would also show that he had been drinking, and his blood alcohol content was 0.12, which, for reference, the limit for driving is typically 0.08. So although he was above the limit, it's not nearly as much as you'd expect for someone to go in the exact opposite direction of their house before going for a fully clothed swim in the middle of the night. Stranger still is they found 2 antidepressants in his blood. Not only would the 2 found in his blood not be prescribed at the same time, Todd's doctor knew nothing about him taking either of them. And on top of all of that, his clothes didn't seem to have the amount of bacteria, insects, or dirt on them that they should have had after all that time. He didn't even have any insects on or in him, which is something that usually happens when a body is exposed for that long. Some experts who looked at this evidence later were sure that he'd only been dead for a couple days before they found him. Quite a few experts have also come forward to say that Todd was likely killed on land and then placed carefully in the lake to be discovered. Unfortunately, none of this evidence was enough to convince the police it was more than an accident. They refused to open the case despite pressure from the family, petitions, and even Todd's case being featured on a TV show. To the police, Todd's death remained a tragic, if unusual, accident. There is another theory to explain this, which is incredibly strange, which I normally wouldn't even go over, but I'm going to do here because there's nothing else to go on. In July 2008, Todd's family found a smiley face disc on top of Todd's tombstone 3 years after he died. Initially, they had no idea what this meant, but they were soon put in touch with Kevin Gannon, a retired detective from the NYPD. Kevin and his colleagues are convinced that either a single killer or a group of them had been capturing people and then taking their lives before leaving them to be found in a body of water. This is because there were a string of deaths matching these exact circumstances between the late 1990s and the early 2010s. So far, according to Kevin, this person or these people are responsible for up to 45 deaths in 11 different US states. All the victims fit a type which is white, popular, athletic, and successful in school. Todd fits that description, but that alone is a bit generic. However, this person or these people also tend to leave a calling card in the form of graffiti or something like the smiley face disc Todd's family found. Weirder still, when Kevin asked Todd's mom if there'd been any other smiley faces, she said a smiley face with horns had been painted on a tree close to the party where everyone could see it. Now, although this is an interesting theory, and although US law enforcement has found links between all these deaths, they don't necessarily mean the deaths are connected. They feel it's more likely that people who know about the smiley face killer theory are painting graffiti close to any suspicious deaths that fit the profile just to antagonize the police and people who believe the idea. So, that leaves several possibilities. There was the theory suggested by police that Todd was simply under the influence of several substances and accidentally drowned as a result, but at the same time, there are seemingly several inconsistencies with this story. These seem to point that he didn't drown at all and was placed in the lake after the fact. If this was the case, was it simply someone he had a confrontation with, or was it the result of something more calculated? Were the smiley faces found real, or are they simply by people who know the myth? So, what do you think? Let me know down in the comments if you have any ideas. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.